So Uptober was hyped up. Everyone thought that October was going to be a very good month for Bitcoin because historically it has been. So it looks like Uptober won't be as up as it usually is. More institutional money is deciding how Bitcoin is moving. And as you mentioned, if there is regulatory clarity and regulatory movement coming in, there's going to be a lot of action in anticipation of that. And I hesitate to say this, but my guess is that, this time actually is different.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed. Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian on X here with another great episode of the Supply Shock podcast. We've got Boaz Sobrado, veteran fintech analyst and market commentator, here to break down Bitcoin's worst October in a decade. That's right, you heard it here. Uptober has turned into a downer of a nightmare, and the data proves it. Boaz, let's jump into the conversation here. A lot of people with high expectations we're really hoping that this Q4 would lead to a revival in the Bitcoin and broader crypto market. That has not come to pass. Let's dive in. What's the TLDR on why not?
Hi, Pete. Yeah, so Uptober was hyped up. Everyone thought that October was going to be a very good month for Bitcoin because historically it has been. So Bitcoin has ended green every single month except for 2018 and 2014. So it's traditionally a very, very good month. It's up. Bitcoin's up on average 20%. However, we're almost through the month already, and we're down 3%. So it looks like Uptober won't be as up as it usually is.
Well, I'll give you my take on this, which is I think that for a while the institutions have been counter trading the Bitcoin and crypto space, right? So I think they hear kind of these tropes and these memes, and essentially, they're using that to fund their trades. So you flash back to April of 2024, the halving, right? There'd never been an all-time high before an halving, and all of a sudden, boom, there's an all-time high before the halving. So I'm curious, what, do you think this is a sign that institutional money is at play? Because one of my theses right now is that I think you're going to see a slow Q4, and then Q1, you wait for some old whales to dump some bags, and then, you rip it and ship it. To Larry Fink, right?
I think that's entirely possible. I think the difficulty with trying to figure out what institutional investors are going to try to do is that we think they're trying to second guess retail investors, whereas there's probably so many things happening behind the scenes that we can't even think of. Right now, the sell-off happened because of supposedly the tariffs. Who knows what's coming in November? However, I will mention that November has historically had the best average performance with a 44% average return. So I think maybe next month, not to mention Q1, might have some positive surprises.
Well, I know there's also some work in Washington, potentially going to be the crypto market structure bill. I think there's been some talk, too, that this has depressed the Bitcoin price. Obviously, there was, optimism that the market structure bill would be in place by October. The government shutdown has exacerbated that. So your take, I guess, is the government getting back to work here, in November, positive sign?
Well, you never know with the government, right? And it's a bit of a silly situation that Bitcoiners are sat around waiting to see what the government does in order to see whether it impacts the price. That being said, I do think this is one of those administrations where it is the most crypto-friendly administration we have seen so far. And if they can bring in clarity and decent market structure to Bitcoin, there's huge upside, as we saw last week as well.
Well, I got to ask, you're talking about ending on a down. We're only down 5% month to date, maybe 3%, a little bit.
Yeah.
3%. So not going to take a ton for a turnaround here. What price are we looking to end the month, delta neutral? And I guess, what are your odds on that? Because it seems like, you have a good end of the week. It's could end up pretty good.
I think we can easily get back and finish the month green. I think the legend of Uptober can continue. If we finish above, I think it was 114, it's going to be green. And we're not that far away from it right now. We're at 110.5.
Well, obviously, a lot of market dynamics at play here. There was a bit of a crash and some liquidations. Bitcoin dropped down to 104K. So maybe let's get into the market dynamics here. And, does this look like the blow off tops the past? You think of the 2022 when there was FTX collapse, 2021 where there was a big high. I think something that people are looking for is is this the end of a euphoria cycle, right? Does this feel like the end of the start of something new? What's your take on that?
So I think that's super interesting because what we saw last week on Binance with the altcoin market is something that you as a historian will be aware of. The sort of flash flashes we used to see all the time in Bitcoin, right? Many of these altcoins literally went to zero and then bounced back up again. Everyone that was playing around with leverage got liquidated. Billions and billions of dollars of leverage positions liquidated on Binance, Bybit, all of these altcoin casinos.
Can we get to the bottom on why that happened, right? I heard the word on the street was this was just market maker bots. A lot of this trading activity is fake, it seems.
I heard that it has to do with market maker bots. I heard that it has to do with the fact that, Binance's orders weren't going through. It has to do also apparently with Athena, which is a synthetic stable coin. Apparently they had some privileged positions on Binance and the sell-off started there. But I think the interesting thing is no matter what happened on the altcoin market with that flash crash, Bitcoin had a sell-off, but it didn't have the sort of flash crash that the altcoin markets had. And I think that's evidence of how far Bitcoin has come in the last couple of years, because not that long ago, when we were looking at FTX, we saw very, very volatile flash crash-like behaviors on Bitcoin as well. Granted, not as the same magnitude as altcoins, but still, Bitcoin has tremendously matured in the last 18 months. The sort of price action that you're seeing resembles nothing what these longer tail crypto assets seem to be doing.
Well, obviously, Bitcoiner is a bit set apart from the rest of the market, but sometimes affected, as this shows. So I guess what are you looking at in terms of the exchanges, right? And CZ just pardoned this week. Obviously, a lot of these exchanges that have been offshore are going to be onshored, right? There's going to be a blending of these markets in the months and years ahead in ways that we haven't seen. So what are you looking for as this new kind of global crypto market comes to the fore?
I think the story is that Bitcoin's coming onshore, right? I think a lot of these markets, which have traditionally been sat in, offshore jurisdictions, Binance is one example, but maybe a better one is Deribit. Deribit was headquartered in Panama, run out of the Netherlands, but now it got acquired by Coinbase, which is, a US listed company. And not to mention CME, which is playing a huge role in Bitcoin markets right now. The fact is that I think all of most of the volume, the trading is coming back onshore. And what that means is it's going to be traded at more regulated venues where you're not going to be second guessing whether a flash crash happened because there was an API outage or because market makers were spoofing orders, or, it's very different whether you're trading on a venue that's licensed on some Caribbean island or whether you're trading somewhere that's under SEC supervision.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how much of this actually does come over to the US though, right? Because essentially, these exchanges, I imagine, are going to have to compete with the rest of the crypto market. And, look, there's a lot of exotic instruments that trade on Binance. They're probably going to make their way to the US markets. They're probably going to be traded on, regulated US platforms, though.
Yeah, well, that's where the regulatory action, the government comes in, right? There's been a lot of whispers about legalizing perps for retail traders in the US. I think if that, for instance, happens, most of the volume is going to come back onshore. Because right now, let's be honest, a lot of the offshore volume is, in fact, US retail traders that are playing the perp game using VPNs. And if that can come home and we can have some more well-regulated and better overseen venues for price discovery, I think we're going to see a positive impact in the long term.
Yeah, and of course, the pardoning of CZ, a bit of symbolic end to this period as well, right? So President Trump comes out yesterday, says, he doesn't even think that what Changpeng Zhao did was criminal. Of course, arrested, served 3 months in prison in California. But Binance really was, the chief skirter of U.S. regulations during the Trump administration and Biden administration. Your take on just what message this sends to the
it's a very controversial thing. A lot of people on Twitter are saying this makes crypto look bad. There's a potential issue with bribery. I'm not super familiar with the details. However, what I will say is that what CZ did end up going to jail for, he's no saint by no means. Binance very much, pushed the rules as much as they could. They definitely broke a few rules, but I've not seen any banker go to jail for very, very similar, if not worse things. I think it's definitely the case that they wanted to make an example out of him by making him serve jail time. The fines were by all means justified. He's not a saint, again, I'm saying, but I'm not sure whether giving him jail time was deserved. So, maybe this pardon is a way of sending a signal to the industry to say, hey, we're going to treat you guys fairly, although a lot of people haven't seen it that way.
Well, of course, I think it opens up the door for CZ to come back in the saddle, maybe take a role at Binance, which, legally he's been excluded from. Let's talk about CME and Binance, right? So there's been a big kind of overtaking there where, as you just said, CME has really now become the center of the global crypto trade in a way that we haven't really seen before. Let's just maybe wind it all the way back. Obviously, people are maybe coming to the crypto markets new, but, the Bitcoin and crypto markets have developed over time. They've been largely internationalized. CME, the antithesis of that. Take us in.
Yeah, so CME, you'll remember better than I will on this, but I think they started crypto trading. They were already live by 2020, right? So did they start
Yeah, they marked the end of that cycle. They launched Bitcoin futures.
Yes.
The price went up to 20K, and then there was a big crash after. Yeah.
And then CME wasn't really a big venue for a long time, but I think now it's symbolic that they've overtaken Binance for BTC features. And I think that really underscores the story that there's a bifurcation of two things: one, the onshore market and the offshore market, and two, Bitcoin and the rest of the altcoins. And what we're seeing really is that, CME, they've consistently managed to grow their position. They've overtaken Binance in BTC futures volume. They also recently overtook Deribit, I think, as a venue for options volume. So they're being, increasingly a well-regulated onshore venue where serious institutional investors can actually invest, and not just, some sort of altcoin casino where, you might lose all your money because of a market outage.
It is interesting, right? I do kind of have questions about how much of these markets, obviously, we're about to see some ETF approvals as well. So, there will be, I would imagine within the coming months, a slew of altcoin ETFs trading on venues like CME, right? Because this is where they would be hosted. So, how long do you think CME can stay immune from some of these dynamics, given that, if you have an XRP ETF, if you have a Solana ETF, if you have these exotic ETFs, they have some of the same underlying assets, right?
I think that's a good point. I mean, the key issue is that it brings on perhaps more serious market players to the market, and more serious market makers as well. So a little bit more of a serious institutional bid and market making, I think, will stabilize prices and reduce volatility, which is kind of what we've seen with Bitcoin over the last couple months as well, somewhat reduced volatility compared to what we are used to. And I think, obviously altcoins are never going to be as, with significantly smaller market caps, are not going to be as stable, if you can call Bitcoin that, as stable as Bitcoin.
Pretty stable this year.
Sorry?
It's been stable-ish this year,
It has been stable, but every time you get used to it being more or less at the same place, it always surprises you. But I think what's also interesting about CME is, I don't know if you've heard, but one of the issues, of course, is that crypto people are used to trading 24/7, right? Bitcoiners are used to trading on weekends, etc. And up until now, that hasn't been an opportunity on CME. In fact, I think most of these big market flash crashes or even big pumps, sometimes to the upside, tend to happen on weekends when the CME, is shut. So I think one very interesting thing is that coming 2026, they've announced that they're planning to launch 24/7 trading. So maybe that will impact volatility to the downside.
Yeah, I think that's part of the whole blending here, right? Everybody kind of says, where's the market heading? And it's, it's just the crypto exchanges are going to become more like regulated exchanges, but the regulated exchanges are become more like crypto exchanges, right? And I think the best articulation of this is, you see the mainstream coverage of Robinhood, right? Robinhood is almost treated as a crypto exchange, like a Coinbase or a Kraken, even though Coinbase and Kraken are more native, right? Those are already kind of considered the same category. And so you sort of have everything in flux, right? And so the question is, and I'm curious for your thoughts. Obviously CME is a venue that's been open to the crypto markets for a while. Other venues like NASDAQ and NYSE, less so, right? With the Bitcoin ETF, maybe a year ago, that's kind of opened up. But I think over time, we're going towards a market where all of these venues look pretty much the same, right? They're all 24/7. They have flavors of the same product. You would imagine that competition will essentially force these different actors to offer similar products, right?
I think you're definitely right in terms of all of the market makers, all of the exchanges that want to be serious players will have to, blend in, and you will see that sort of blending that you mentioned, where crypto exchanges will become more similar to traditional exchanges, and traditional exchanges will become more similar to crypto exchanges. I think that's definitely true. I think one other aspect that we shouldn't forget is that there's always going to be demand for offshore, lightly regulated venues. I think those will continue to exist, but I think those will be a lot less important in moving market prices and for price discovery moving forward in the next few years.
I'm curious sort of what you think about the tokenized stocks narrative. I think this is a big one that hasn't really gotten the mainstream attention that it maybe deserves. Stablecoins obviously having their moment, but this idea that you can have stable stocks, right? Stocks that kind of move 24/7, borderless, global. Obviously, Kraken, Robinhood, Coinbase kind of moving on this. Very much an innovator's market. How far off do you think we are from seeing a tokenized stock blend with something like a stock exchange? Does that happen this cycle?
I think this is a question that I've been wondering about I think the first one was released in like 2018. I know that FTX already had some in 2020, some tokenized stocks via a Swiss provider. So there's been attempts to tokenize stocks for many, many years now, but it hasn't really taken off yet. I continue to believe it's a matter of time. I think perhaps there can be some sort of regulatory action this government that will make it somehow easier. I'm not entirely sure what the regulatory roadblocks are for that, though. Do you know? Because I'm very surprised it hasn't taken off yet. It seems like such a no-brainer.
Yeah, it's a very interesting product right now. I think a lot of the conventional issuers are upset because, the way that these stocks are issued. So essentially, you'll have a traditional, kind of middleman, third party like a Coinbase or a Kraken. They'll come out and they'll register a bunch of shares and then essentially tokenize them on a blockchain, in which case they float very freely. I think the traditional brokers obviously don't like that activity because it expands the market, and creates the different market dynamics. And I think there's been some lawsuits that have tried to kind of stop the issuance of them, but this is how this technology moves, right? And it's hard to put it back in the bottle.
I think the interesting thing that's going to happen is what happens if they get issued already in a tokenized form, right? So the IPO market's turned back on a little bit. Maybe some innovative crypto company. There's got a few crypto IPOs coming up next year. Maybe some innovative crypto company is going to decide to IPO in a tokenized way. You're going to be able to buy your shares on the brokerage, but also do it on chain.
Well, I was going to say, it would be remiss not to mention that ICOs or initial coin offerings are having a little bit of a comeback, right? There was a pretty large ICO earlier this year when it came to Pump.Fun, kind of, breaking the taboo, the 7-year taboo of, the sort of idea that you can raise capital from the global crypto markets. And then Coinbase just this week announcing that it was purchasing essentially an ICO token issuance platform from one Kobe, the host of the Up Only podcast, purchasing that for nearly $400 million, signaling, I think, an interest that on-chain capital formation might have a bit of a renaissance.
I mean, I don't know what Coinbase execs are thinking, but they're probably very well connected to what regulators and lawmakers are thinking. And maybe that's where the buck is going. I think there have been statements from, if I remember correctly, Steve Schwarzman from BlackRock saying tokenized equities is where the future is. And I think it's entirely possible that within the next 2 years or so, capital formation and what we now know as IPOs will look a lot more like 2017 ICOs. Again, confirming your thesis of crypto becoming more like finance and finance becoming more like crypto.
Well, I think that's troubling because the 2017 era, not my favorite. I don't think that the risks were really properly disclosed. I've always wanted a bit more of a disclosure apparatus around, the ICOs. I think if you look at the performance, a lot of the ones from 2017 in Bitcoin terms, a lot of them down, significantly, if they're still operational.
I think I would say all of them are down in Bitcoin terms.
There might be a couple outliers. BNB, right? I think might still be up a little bit in Bitcoin terms, right? So maybe the one exception to the rule, but there's been a long history of this not working. So and I think myself, I've been more comfortable with this idea that you can do Bitcoin-backed securities on a traditional stock exchange, maybe something more like a strategy, or at least you have those regulations, disclosures, so you have a bit of a token that trades freely, but there is some regulatory guardrails around it. I guess, what do you think about the ICO market coming back to its old ways? Do you think it needs to mature and grow up? Or are you ready to ape into the next pumped up fund?
I think the IPO market as it existed in 2017 was definitely not a success story. And I think public markets and IPOs and investor prospectuses exist for a reason. So that definitely needs to mature. However, I think there are some very interesting stories there, even if the price-wise they haven't been that successful. If you think back to Augur, which was an ICO for a prediction market, it did terribly. It didn't work out. They raised a lot of ETH. I think they still have a lot of Ethereum, but it never led to anything. But, in the ashes, you have companies like Polymarket and Kalshi, which admittedly did not do an ICO, but followed in their footsteps and are now becoming multi-billion-dollar companies. So, maybe that's the story there. Maybe, that the ideas that were fertilized back then ended up coming back in different iterations. Or, maybe it was just a cash grab. Who knows? Who knows if a Polymarket or Kalshi would have happened if these ICO ancestors didn't exist.
If you were to ask me, is a recession coming? The first question should be, is the market going down? This is why the forward guidance is way more important than the actual policy.
I'm Felix, host of the Forward Guidance podcast, and somebody who's wildly obsessed with all things macro and crypto and where the two worlds collide.
Once we looked at the world through this lens of the debasement of fiat currency, we realized there's actually only two assets that outperform this.
10-year yields went from 360 to 480 in 5 months while the Fed was raising rates. Sorry, Jay Powell, that was a rejection of the policy.
Whether it's Michael Howell breaking down global liquidity or Joseph Wang dissecting monetary policy, we talk to the best and brightest so you can always stay on top of the most important stories driving macro.
You add up tariffs and big beautiful bill, the train is stopped. In fact, it's going in reverse.
A year ago was the first time in 25 years of doing this that every little single thing that I looked at told me to sell.
We cover everything from inflation to interest rates to bonds and Bitcoin and all the biggest forces shaping the global economy. Subscribe to Forward Guidance and stay one step ahead of the next big move.
Yeah, hard to say. Well, let's flip the switch to the Bitcoin corporate adoption. It was the big story in the first half of the year. Obviously, a huge swelling in the amount of corporates that are putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet, over 300 now in total public companies globally. I think over 100 other, known private companies that are adding Bitcoin to the balance sheet. We've seen the pipes raise. We've seen them come and go. There's a bit of a washout in the sector, but MicroStrategy, the model remains. Their stock is positive and they're sitting on 640,000 Bitcoin, almost 200,000 of which were purchased this year. So, there's something here, no?
Yeah, I think so too. I think there's several aspects to this whole corporate Bitcoin craze. I mean, I understood the beginning of it. I'm not sure I fully understood the latest iteration of it. I mean, at the very beginning with MicroStrategy, it made total sense, right? There's no Bitcoin ETF. People want to have exposure to Bitcoin. They have nowhere to buy it on a regulated venue. They go out and they buy MicroStrategy. Michael Slater did really, really well with that. Then, if I understood correctly, it became a vehicle for buying leveraged Bitcoin. But then that has somehow morphed into all sorts of companies. I think 48 new public companies in Q3 2025 alone adding Bitcoin to their balance sheets. It's hard for me to understand whether all 48 of these new public companies have a convincing story other than I bought some Bitcoin, please buy my stock. But that being said, you have to look at what the motivation of it is, right? So is the motivation trying to get ahead of this whole debasement trade? Are they uncomfortable with how fiat currencies are heading towards? Or are they jumping on the bandwagon? They're trying to say, hey, I bought some Bitcoin, buy my stock. What do you think is driving these 48 new companies to buy Bitcoin in Q3?
Well, I think the other thing you haven't mentioned is Metaplanet, right? So MicroStrategy, obviously kind of the patient number one, but I think Metaplanet proved that it could go international and that you could go really big, right? Within a year, they bought 50,000 Bitcoin, and they've, really were the hottest stock in Japan for an entire year. So, I think that my thesis on this is just that there are reasons why, regulatory arbitrage exists. It's a real thing. And, these companies are taking advantage of it, right? So I think when you look at Metaplanet, it's a function of three things, right? Essentially, it's the tax regime in Japan is punitive to Bitcoin holders. There's no Bitcoin ETF. And it's really hard, for folks there to get access and get favorable tax treatment, and the regulations, as much as the government is saying that they're coming, they're not here yet, right? We heard earlier in this year that Japan was going to pass a Bitcoin ETF, but it hasn't come to pass. So, if you look at a pure arbitrage function, right, let's just say if the only thing that Metaplanet did was close those loopholes or exploit those loopholes, well, the end result is they have 30,000 Bitcoin. They can launch a new financial institution. And I think that, opportunity exists in pretty much every capital market that's sufficiently large enough where the barriers to entry are there, and that set off a kind of global race. Obviously, in the more developed markets, hard to say, right? I think we've seen acquisitions like Semler Scientific getting purchased by Strive, right? Those are kind of the combinations you're going to see when some of these businesses fall below NAV and they can't, issue equity and continue to buy Bitcoin. So, some of these pipes that raised a lot of money, coins, the stocks are down pretty significantly. They aren't able to issue new equity shares and kind of start those positive flywheels. I think you're going to see some consolidation there. But, look, I boil it down real simply. I say, Michael Saylor, he's really good at kind of obfuscating with like really Byzantine language. And look, I've been in Bitcoin a long time, since 2013. Every random, person of average intelligence who I know who bought Bitcoin has done very well. And if we assume that every business of average acumen that stacks Bitcoin is going to be better off owning Bitcoin than owning their local fiat currency, I think it's 2013 in Bitcoin business land, right? I don't think we know how to run a Bitcoin company on a Bitcoin standard. I think these companies are excavating that terrain. Obviously Metaplanet is the example, I think, of the most extreme version of that you can have, right? A company that's extremely short fiat and extremely leveraged long Bitcoin. And there's going to be all kind of flavors in the middle, right? From people like Tesla and Square that, have some on their balance sheet and just use that as a hedge, to companies that actively accumulate. And I think, right now it's up to the innovators to go and create new models and push it forward. But I'm not bearish on the category by any means. And I do think we're at the start of a likely 10-year kind of excavation of this area.
I mean, on the regulatory side, the international regulatory environment totally makes sense. I mean, we sometimes forget that just because the US is quite bullish and friendly in a regulatory perspective to crypto doesn't mean the rest of the world immediately is. In fact, in the UK, where I recently lived, the FCA banned retail investors from buying Bitcoin in cash advantaged accounts or their pensions from 2020 up until basically September 2025. So for 5 years, retail investors that wanted to have tax advantaged ways to invest in Bitcoin in their pensions or other savings accounts, they couldn't do it. Similar story to Japan. So from that angle, it makes total sense that there's a lot of demand for these Bitcoin Treasury companies because, they don't have a better vehicle.
Yep. And I think people will remember it's a three-sided marketplace, right? You have the institutional investors who, essentially have to invest in regulated products, so they're interested and there's also the companies themselves who want to acquire Bitcoin, and then there's the retail investors, right? And so that's the flywheel, right? When it's working, Metaplanet was able to kind of turn a positive sentiment into amongst those groups to, getting capital together. But Smarter Web in the UK, sitting on 2,000 Bitcoin, potentially the opportunity to do the same. As I said, I think it's like many things in the Bitcoin and crypto world, it's always the things that look a little bit weird that seem to stick around and survive. And it's usually the stuff that ends up very consensus that ends up being a little bit more short-lived. So maybe flipping over to what was another big topic at the start of the year, this idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. We've recently probably had the biggest signal yet that the U.S. will be strategically accumulating, yet there was hardly any price impact to this. I'm talking about what happened with Prince Holding Group. This was a sort of Cambodian money laundering and drug and human trafficking, I wouldn't call it a business, but scheme that essentially, accumulated 120 something thousand Bitcoin over almost a decade. And now this is in the U.S. government's hands, yet we don't seem to be reacting positively to this. This coin's out the market, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a super interesting story, right? Because after the election, people were hoping that the government would buy Bitcoin outright. It would add it to a Bitcoin reserve. There would be a price impact from that. Obviously, that didn't happen. But what did happen, correct me if I'm wrong, is that President Trump said that whatever Bitcoin is actually acquired by the government through, for instance, seizing assets of criminals would not be sold. Now, what's now happened is that 127,000 Bitcoin got off the market, and yet you can tell that investors are a little bit antsy because there was no positive market impact, right? So billions and billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin are now, quote unquote, safe in the government's hands. And if they stick to their promise of not selling it, then they're basically permanently off the market from now on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was probably the most bullish news maybe of the whole year. You combine that with earlier estimates from Scott Bessent, where, he said that the government earlier this year had a $15 billion in Bitcoin. If you put it together with this haul, you're looking at estimates range from, 200 and something thousand to 300,000 Bitcoin. I mean, that's already almost double the initial estimates of the U.S. government holdings. But yeah, what will it take for the market to price it in? I think is the question. I think it's that the Trump government does have to publish a little bit more information about the strategic reserve, right? I think they've been pretty cagey about disclosing how the funds are held, how much has actually been audited. There's been a lot of rampant speculation on that. There were some FOIA requests dug up on the internet by the Rage, a reporting group out of Europe. That Bitcoin holdings of the government may have been as low as 20,000. So I think just lack of official information here is really the big barrier, right?
I think that's the biggest problem, right? So for all the speculation we have about the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve and for all the promises that we have that they're not going to sell the assets that they end up taking from criminals, nevertheless, the fact that we don't actually know how much Bitcoin that is part of the reason why we haven't seen the positive market impact yet. We just need a little bit more clarity from the government in terms of what the actual plan is. I think they might not actually know it themselves yet, but hopefully within the next 6 months, we're going to hear something from them with an actual number attached. And I suspect that number is going to be possibly bigger than some of the estimates we've seen so far, simply because nobody knows how much Bitcoin the government has via all sorts of methods.
Yeah, lots of interesting ethical questions around that as well. There's people talking about victim restitution. Obviously, in the UK, a similar seizure is taking place. Around 61,000 Bitcoin will get sold off, but a lot of people who want to see that money go to the victims. I mean, you got to imagine if you spend several years in a Cambodian prison, you'd hope that you'd be entitled to some restitution. Does that diminish the total assets here? How much do we know about this haul and how that money could get appropriated for other uses?
I mean, I'm not super familiar with what the legal custom is in these circumstances, but I suspect that actually tracking down and figuring out who the victims were over a 10-year long activity, I think that will be very difficult. What will probably happen is that my guess is that some percentage of the funds might be allocated to the victims who will receive some sort of symbolic amount if they're able to contact them. But I believe that, generally what happens when large amounts of criminal funds get seized is that they effectively do go to the state. But I'm not super sure about that. So we'll have to see.
On to some more positive news, kind of winding down here, we have seen some efforts in the U.S. for Bitcoin to be used more, maybe in the original way it was intended as money, and Square this past week really coming out and following through on announcements from earlier this year, going to be turning on its entire merchant network, giving them the option to accept Bitcoin via the Lightning Network, pretty much the largest attempt we've ever seen at retail adoption through merchants. This hits home for me as a 2013, 2014 cycle baby. This was really the kind of hope and optimism of the time. So if you flash back all the way 2013 and 14, I've been writing articles about Overstock.com and Newegg accepting Bitcoin for payments. And this was sending the price rallying. I remember Microsoft accepting Bitcoin, sent Bitcoin up 10% in a single day. So this may be a return to the roots. Jack Dorsey, kind of seen as as the sort of a Bitcoin wizard that he is, really putting his business on the line, switching over to being a Bitcoin company in 2021. Now we're seeing the dividends. Your thoughts on how the market is reacting, and Square shareholders who have weathered all of this transition?
Yeah, Square shareholders have been through some pain. I think, I don't know. In a way, I also had a sense of deja vu with this. You can finally buy a coffee using Bitcoin. Do you remember what your first in-person Bitcoin transaction was with a merchant?
Would have been at Veggie Galaxy in Boston, Massachusetts. It was a vegan pizza store.
Oh, nice. I bought a beer at Room 77 in Berlin back when that was still open. So we've had a few venues here and there that are merchants that accept Bitcoin, but we've never quite had a mainstream payment terminal in the US, big retail point of sale accept Bitcoin like this. So even though, I'm getting a little bit flashbacks from El Salvador and lots of videos on Twitter of people buying McDonald's and Starbucks and whatnot using Lightning, I think this is the first time it's showing up in the US, and it's interesting to see how it will end up. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the El Salvador experience fizzled out a little bit. Wasn't quite, didn't end up being quite as successful as people hoped it would be. And Room 77 in Berlin no longer exists, presumably because they've been selling beers for Bitcoin since 2015. So they probably don't need to run the bar anymore. What do you think? Is it going to be a little bit like El Salvador, where, in-person merchant payments are not going to be that acceptable? Or is it going to be the start of something new? Maybe with tax treatment changes. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's the big one, is the tax treatment, right? I think it's great that Jack's pushing this forward, keeping the narrative alive. Obviously, we want Bitcoin to be money. We want Bitcoin to be used. A lot of the derivative technology arguments are sort of based in this, sort of idea that, we need the blockchain to have transactions to be healthy. And, what we need is to create a circular economy around Bitcoin. I like to say that, there's no Bitcoin dream that ever dies, right? There's 100 different ways to use Bitcoin. They're all pretty valid, and, they each have their day in the sun. As much as we think of each of these cycles, they get sort of painted and with certain aspirations and certain dreams. This is that you can still use a Bitcoin to pay for something just as you could 10, 15 years ago when people were buying alpaca socks. There's no reason that a Bitcoin payment is any less good than any other payment. And, I think that it might be one of those things where, gradually becomes, ubiquitous, right? At some point, if you send an email, you weren't able to attach a signed document. You still had to go and print out a piece of paper and, send it in somewhere, right? So this idea that you'll get to full adoption, right? People on both sides of every transaction kind of both transacting, right? On the internet, when's the last time you interfaced with a printer? Probably been, 5 or 6 months, maybe, myself pretty rarely. And that's because we're at a ubiquity of technological adoption that took 4 years, right? So, I think Bitcoin has a similar curve, right? We're still going to need other tools like stable coins and credit cards and other things to get us there. But, I do love Jack being the idealist and just soldiering forth, right? There are a few businesses that can really bear the brunt of being idealistic. And his does seem to be, though I don't know if the stockholders always like that. I'm sure there was a bunch of people who own Square stock who wish it was a bit more of a MicroStrategy and was more focused on delivering shareholder value. But I don't know. Look, I mean, if you're going to go down with that ship, it's a good ship. So, I appreciate Jack's.
Yeah, what I really appreciate about Jack about this as well is this meme about being able to not even buy a coffee with Bitcoin has been ongoing for so long. And I really appreciate the fact that he's made the very, very first retail outlet that came online to accept Bitcoin payments via SquarePay to be Compass Coffee. I think that was very, very kind of him to give Bitcoiners the rhetorical tool to be able to reply and say, no, you can actually buy coffee using Bitcoin.
All right, well, let's wind it down with the last question. We're coming up on the end of Q4. There's a lot of people who think this time is different. This has been the question I've been asking a lot of the podcasts. What are you thinking? Is this time different? Do we see the blow off top end of the cycle all-time high over the next 14 weeks, or is there something new at play here? Boaz, you're plugged into the financial world. What's the word on the street?
My guess is, and I hesitate to say this, but my guess is that, this time actually is different. I think the broader crypto altcoin market is definitely very tired. Retail investors are exhausted. They don't have more mental space for yet another ICO pump fund, et cetera. The hot ball of money has moved on to stocks, most recently Beyond Meat. There's just lots of signs of froth, and the froth isn't even interested in altcoins anymore. But I think Bitcoin this time is actually different. I think that what we saw in the crash as well, that Bitcoin isn't quite moving in the same way as the broader altcoin market. It's unfortunately not moving the way many of us wish it did, like Nvidia or like gold most recently. But it is moving in a very slow and steady pace. And I think that is because precisely the market participants, companies, et cetera, these are playing an ever bigger role in the price discovery of Bitcoin. So the retail flash crashes and sort of retail memes about Uptober, et cetera, are playing less and less of a role, and more institutional money is deciding how Bitcoin is moving. And as you mentioned, if there is regulatory clarity and regulatory movement coming in, and if that's scheduled for Q1, then potentially there's going to be a lot of action in anticipation of that.
Could be big things on the way, potentially an upward move in store. Boaz, where can people find out more about your work?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm Sobrado, or x.com now.
Well, appreciate all the thoughts. Of course, you can find out so much more at blockworks.co. Explore the universe of Blockworks podcasts from everything from Solana to the mainstream financial markets with forward guidance. There are a number of podcasts outside of Supply Shock to check out. So if you're on YouTube, smash that like and subscribe button. Give us a follow or a comment if you've been enjoying the content, and feel free to check out what else there is in store at blockworks.co. For now, this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast.